The DC statehood movement has been going on for many years, probably since the founding of the country itself. People in Washington, D.C. are very unique in the sense that while they pay federal taxes and they actually do have voting power in the presidential election, they get 3 electoral votes for the president of the United States. It actually counts. But one thing they don't have is representation in Congress. They don't have representatives in the House. They don't have the 2 senators that any other state would have that's granted by the Constitution, even though Washington, D.C. has a larger population than the state of Wyoming, which, granted, is the least populous state in the Union, but still, they have representation in Congress, but the people of D.C. do not. So it presents a very interesting dilemma in democracy in the United States because while we talk about how people have representation, there are a good number of Americans, about 750,000, almost 800,000 at this point, they don't have any at all. So even though they're paying the same taxes we are, even though they are citizens like we are, they don't have anything. So you would think statehood would be a good solution to that because it would provide them with the representation in Congress that they deserve. But hold on a second. Because, that sounds like a great idea. It sounds like something that should have happened a long time ago. But it hasn't. This entire time, it has not happened. Why is that? Well, it's because of politics, really. Because it's not just about the way that Washington, D.C. was set up, because, the whole point of D.C. was to be its own federal enclave controlled by the federal government, and then the states are their own thing. Maryland donated part of their land to form D.C., and that is how Washington, D.C. came to be. Virginia also donated some land, but they ended up getting it back because the people of Virginia did not want to be part of D.C. They wanted to be part of Virginia. I think it was part of Alexandria and a couple of other towns that were supposed to be Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. was actually supposed to be a lot bigger. It used to be a lot bigger than it is right now. So all the land that is currently Washington, D.C. was all land donated by Maryland. And Democrats obviously have been pushing for DC statehood or at the very least, maybe not call it a state because that may go against the whole premise of Washington, D.C., but at least have it where, when they added that amendment to the Constitution that gave D.C. votes in the Electoral College, do something similar where you're not calling D.C. a state, but at least the people of D.C. get their one representative of the House based off their population, because usually like one in 750,000 people is a congressperson. That's why New York City alone has a whole bunch of congress people, because it's based off of population. So they'll get their one congressperson, but then they'll also get their 2 senators, which is the main reason why DC statehood has not happened. Washington, D.C. is overwhelmingly Democratic, votes overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. And while there are a lot of states that also are towards the Democrats, New York, California, New Jersey, Washington State, so many others, D.C. is on a whole nother level. To put it into context, since D.C. was able to vote in presidential elections in 1964, during the entire 60-year period that D.C. has been able to vote for president, not once have they voted for a Republican. That includes the 1984 Ronald Reagan landslide, in which he defeated Walter Mondale 49 states to 1. And the one state that Reagan lost was only by a couple of percentage points. It was still a very close election, and it was Minnesota, which was Walter Mondale's home state. That's the only reason why Reagan did not win all 50 of those states. But he lost D.C. He didn't just lose D.C. He only got 13% of the vote in Washington, D.C. A Republican that won in a complete blowout, in a complete landslide, only got 13% of the vote in Washington, D.C. I believe also in the last presidential election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, Trump only got about 7 or 8% of the vote, something like that. Like, it's such a ridiculous number. So, putting that into context, you can understand now why Republicans, especially, do not want DC to not only become states, because there's a way to not have them be a state. DC can still be a federally controlled thing, but at least give the people of DC their congressional representation like everyone else does in the United States. It would give 2 guaranteed Democratic senators for the entire Senate. So it would expand the Senate from 100 seats to 102 seats, and those 2 seats would automatically be Democratic, and there would be absolutely no chance at flipping those states. You see, when Hawaii and Alaska were admitted to the Union as states in the late 1950s, the reason why, first of all, they were 2 states that were admitted at around the same time. The reason why that was able to happen is because of political compromise. Hawaii at the time was a Republican state. Alaska at the time was a Democratic state. So adding 2 senators and congressional representatives, and really the whole congressional representative thing doesn't matter because, you can give, they would only have 1 congressperson. That wouldn't really change the balance of power. It would add 1 seat, so there'd be 436 seats. And a lot of the time, because Republicans right now have like a 12-seat, 13-seat majority, that's considered very slim. Usually it's like 30, 40 plus seats. So 1 extra seat for the Democrats wouldn't really matter. But with 2 senators, that would completely change the balance of power. They were able to do it because it balanced it out with Hawaii and Alaska. But with DC, there would be nothing to counterbalance it for the Republicans. So it's pretty much dead on arrival because in order to allow people of DC to vote, they would have to change the Constitution. In order to change the Constitution, you need 2/3 of the votes in Congress, which you're not going to get with our divided government. It's just never going to happen. You would need a very supermajority of Democrats in order to pull that off. And then you have to get 3/4 of the state legislators, so 38 states to get on board. There are definitely more. There are definitely more than half of the states that are very Republican that would not want Democrats to get 2 new Senate seats. So it's never going to happen, basically. There is no way that DC is going to get their representation. There's only one way. Actually, Republicans have proposed a solution to this. They've been like, hey, people of DC, you guys can have your representation. You guys want to have that? Then that's fine. But the catch is that DC would no longer be DC, except for the White House, the Capitol building, the National Mall, and a couple of other. It would just be like a very, very tiny portion of DC that would stay part of the federal jurisdiction, while the rest of the city, where you have actual people living there, would become part of Maryland, because Maryland was the original home. It was the original land that DC originated from. This would solve the problem because the people of Maryland would now finally have representation in the House, because they would get the extra population that DC would add to Maryland would be enough for Maryland to get another representative. And naturally, that representative would be a representative for DC. As far as the 2 senators go, well, they have the 2 Maryland senators that represent them and would have to recognize their what they want politically and the things that they care about. Even though politicians don't give a shit about what you care about, but people like to think they do. So, that's all nice and everything. So that is a solution Republicans have proposed, which to me seems like a fairly reasonable one, all things considered. Because if you were a Republican, or let's just say Washington D.C., hypothetically D.C. was as Republican can get. They were the most conservative voting constituents in the country. The same people right now talking about DC statehood and talking about how the DC voters are disenfranchised wouldn't want DC to become a state if they were conservative voters. They just wouldn't. So it's all politics. You guys need to understand that. And I'm sure deep down everyone does. Even if you believe in DC statehood and all that kind of stuff, you do recognize the political motivation by everybody, whether you're, the politicians that are for it and the politicians that are against it. So honestly, that's the only way I can realistically seeing DC. They wouldn't even be getting statehood because they would become absorbed into a different state. The people of DC don't think that's enough. That's not suitable enough for them because they want to be their own. I mean, really, they want to have 2 more Democrat senators because they're very, very, very liberal. That's really what it comes down to. Because otherwise, it seems like they would want something like that because at least they would get more representation. But they don't because they want the 2 extra Democrats in the Senate. That's just the reality of the situation. So it's either that or add in a Republican state somehow, like either by taking away parts, like maybe like California or something, but that's realistically never going to happen either. No state is going to want to give up their land to form another one, to split. The last time that happened was West Virginia from Virginia, and that's because West Virginia was pro-union and Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy. So that's why we had the split with Virginia. We're never going to have anything like that again. I don't see how that's ever going to happen. The only other way is imperialism. The U.S. takes over some country that happens to be conservative and maybe wants them to be, wants to be part of the U.S. somehow. I don't know. There's no realistic situation because even realistically, let's say Democrats get more seats. It's still not enough to change the Constitution. Never. So it's just one of those things that we're going to have to face for the rest of our lives. And it will be my child, my grandchild, my great-grandchild, and going way down. Like 200 years from now, this will probably still be a problem, is what I'm trying to say. And, part of me kind of feels bad for the people of D.C., but another part of me is like, if you guys really want it, then be part of Maryland. Is there really that much of a cultural difference between Washington, D.C. and Maryland? I could see if Maryland was like ruby red conservative, I can get why you wouldn't want to be a part. But Maryland's also one of the most liberal states in the union, so it would be a good match. It would be a good fit. And the federal government gets to keep their own jurisdiction over the stuff that matters, like the White House and Congress. That all seems like a good solution for me, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just crazy. I also don't really want 2 more Democrats in the Senate. I'm going to be completely honest because that would not be a good thing. No, it wouldn't.